The battle over voting rights in the U.S. is intensifying. In recent weeks, we have seen a wave of legal developments that could reshape how Americans cast their ballots in this year's midterm elections. Just yesterday, the DOJ targeted several new states suing for the release of voter roll information. And during this week's State of the Union, President Trump continued to push unproven claims of voter fraud while urging passage of the Save America Act, a controversial proposal critics warn could dramatically change voter registration all across the nation. Washington Secretary of State now raising concerns it could force voters here to re-register and create costly challenges. Joining us now is legal expert Erin Carr, assistant professor of law at Seattle University. Erin, thanks for being with us tonight.
Hi, Joyce.
So the DOJ has sued 20 plus mostly Democratic states for voter records under the 1960 Civil Rights Act. What does that law require on access?
Well, in their efforts to gain access to sensitive state-controlled voter data, the Department of Justice has argued that it can compel the complete disclosure of unredacted state voter registration rolls under Title III of the Civil Rights Act, as well as several other federal laws. The Civil Rights Act was a response to voting-related racial discrimination during the Jim Crow era, when states relied on literacy tests, voter IDs, and poll taxes to systematically deny Black Americans the right to vote. And to conceal this voter suppression, state officials would destroy and alter voter registration records to obstruct the federal government's investigation into patterns and practices of racial discrimination. So the Civil Rights Act was passed in order to combat these practices, and it requires states to retain voting records, and it authorizes the Department of Justice to access those records to assess states' compliance with federal election and civil rights law. But here, however, without providing evidence of voter disenfranchisement or election irregularities, the Department of Justice has broadly claimed that it both needs and is legally entitled to access states' entire unredacted voter rolls to ensure compliance with federal laws. Several federal courts, though, have disagreed and have already dismissed the Department of Justice's claims.
And what are the privacy issues from access to unredacted voter rolls?
Yeah, so the vast amount of confidential data that the federal government has demanded from states has prompted serious privacy concerns and also has raised significant questions about how the administration intends to use this information. If the DOJ were allowed to repurpose the Civil Rights Act to collect highly sensitive information, it would potentially expose millions of voters' Social Security numbers, addresses, phone numbers, voter history, political party registration, driver's license numbers, language preferences, and their current voter registration status. So it would comprise an enormous amount of personal information that would be in the hands of the federal government.
And with no idea how that might be used. So how do these lawsuits fit into the broader federal efforts to overhaul voter registration in elections?
The highly unusual push for federal access to state voter rolls is part of a broader coordinated federal effort to rewrite voting rules, redraw congressional maps, weaken voter rights protections, and generally pressure election officials. These efforts to fundamentally change the electoral process have centered on a multi-pronged strategy that has involved executive and congressional action as well as litigation. These efforts have involved the issuance of executive orders to impose the president's authority over various aspects of elections. It has involved proposed federal legislation that would result in widespread voter disenfranchisement. It has involved ongoing litigation to eliminate the Voting Rights Act and limit mail-in voting nationwide. It has involved FBI raids on local election offices And it most recently culminated in direct calls by the president to nationalize elections.
I guess finally, Erin, I don't have time for all I want to ask you, but big picture, how could all of this impact the midterms?
We are fortunate in that we have a strong electoral process, and that strength really is premised on a decentralized system in which we have incredibly dedicated and competent elected elective officials who administer this process. But it is something that we should closely monitor because what we are seeing from the federal government is a source of concern.
And there should be every expectation those efforts will ramp up as we get closer to the midterms versus the opposite of that. Erin Carr from Seattle University, thank you so much for your time tonight.